Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Convergence of Security and Fraud. My name is Rosemary Cipriano. I am the senior content writer here at Human, and I am so excited to be joined by Sandy and Alad. Can you guys introduce yourselves and how we're going to do it like we do it at Human? We want to know who you are, title, company, but most importantly, I would think, is your favorite robot. So, Sandy, why don't you go first?
All right. My name's Sandy Carielli. I'm a principal analyst at Forrester Research. I cover application security. I've been with Forrester for over 4 years. And favorite robot, I'm going to go with Lieutenant Commander Data from Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Such a good one. Thank you so much for that. Alad, you're up.
My name is Alad Ami. I'm a VP of product at Human Security. My favorite robot, and this kind of shows just how old I am, is Vicky from Small Wonder, who personally, I had a crush on her when I was like 5. So that's my favorite robot.
I remember that show. That was a fun show.
It was, wasn't it?
Yeah, totally.
I'm sorry, I don't know that show. Alad, you stumped me. Well, thank you guys so much for being here, for wanting to have this conversation. There's been a groundswell of conversation around the merging of security and fraud teams in an effort to stay ahead of bad bots and bad actors. This convergence title is still a new idea, as these functions are typically like siloed at organizations. And today we're going to have an open conversation about what this merging of teams can do for the fight against fraud and bots, recommendations for organizations looking to enact this change, and the role of traditional cybersecurity. So our first question, we want to dig into what are those typical roles of the security and fraud teams. So what do these teams traditionally look like? Sandy, do you want to start?
I mean, from the security team standpoint, I think the real difference here is, they're dealing with, on the application security side, traditional application security and cybersecurity issues, and they're looking for attacks on the applications that they've deployed in production. They're looking for attacks that are potentially taking advantage of OWASP type vulnerabilities. They're looking for attacks that are obviously leveraging bad bots and other such things. They're really looking for attacks that are in some way taking advantage of flaws or business logic in the application. And it's very much tied to that. Whereas fraud, it's a little bit more than just the security piece. And it's often coming from, I would say as well, reports from their customers about problems with credit card statements or someone taking over an account or other types of incidents where it's almost dealing with the result of the attack as much as trying to identify and block the attack in progress. Alad, I don't know what your thoughts are on that, though.
I think maybe the kind of to give some example of it, because I think the description is spot on. What we're seeing from these security teams is that they're more interested in understanding the volume of the issue, or blocking the majority of it. Again, depending on the use case and everything, but they're more interested in visibility and your solution being hands-off and allowing you to communicate the general problem and mitigation, while from fraud, because it's the end result and there's always a human being at the end of that result, they care about the details much more. They want to case manage it. They want to understand exactly what happened, who is the individual user, and be able to tell them the story of, hey, we blocked your account because we've seen A, B, and C happen. So it's a different mindset, and from that, different behaviors within the teams, and then different tools.
It's a good point, because there's the aspect from the fraud team that security doesn't have to worry about it as much, which is how do you resolve the customer's upset? How do you make sure this person remains a customer? How do you make sure that they don't get disappointed in you, storm off, decide that they want to do business elsewhere as a result of how you handle their fraud complaint?
Yeah, exactly.
So with that, do these teams talk? Are they starting to? If they don't, why aren't they? You would think they would.
Silos.
Definitely.
They don't talk enough. It's getting better. It's certainly better than it was a few years ago, but let me give you an example. A couple of years ago, when I did the bot management wave, I asked the customer references about their top use cases for bot management. And look, credential stuffing and account takeover is still the most common use case and priority for a lot of these organizations. But somewhere in the middle, around I think 36% said that marketing and ad fraud was a high priority. Now, you would think if that were the case, you would see an equivalent number of organizations say that their marketing teams were involved in using and leveraging the product and getting results from it. But that number was only 9%. So there's a disconnect between what is important to the security team as they're using the product and how much they are engaging the other teams in leveraging that data, using the product, getting the results. And I think we see that in a couple of other areas, but it really stood out in marketing.
A lot. Anything to add there?
I think my only problem with the question is that it sounds binary. And I think to Sandy's point, it's not a whether like are people working together or not. It depends. Like I think what we've seen over the course of the last few years is kind of three different options. Some companies just don't have the difference ingrained in them. They just, whether it's because of the majority of the organization or the vertical that they're in, like the industry. And some of them on the other end are like Sandy described, they're just so siloed that it's insane. I think the important piece is that we've seen much more success, both for the security team and the team that they're working with, whether it's marketing or trust and safety or just plain old fraud, depending on the organization. The success rates for like using our products are just much higher when this cooperation happens because of the organizational alignment that I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about in a few minutes.
And a lot, I would add to that. I think it's true, not just with bots, but with any aspect of security that ultimately impacts the customer in some way or impacts other teams. Bad things happen when you go it alone, but if you actually share the data cross team, then potentially you're helping another team diagnose issues. So I was doing some research into API security earlier this year, and I spoke to one end user who talked to me about the importance of sharing that type of data because they said that once they did, they were able to help another team help diagnose an issue. So yeah, sharing data and communicating is going to be really important cross-functionally, regardless of the kind of underlying attack or technology being taken advantage of.
Completely agree. Like this kind of alignment is exactly what's sometimes missing. Not always, but sometimes.
Better than it was, but still more work to do. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
Definitely.
I feel like there's a lot of lessons we can all pull out of this just in general about working. Oh, wow. Information sharing works. That's great.
Talking to people helps, Rosemary. What do you know?
Ooh, what a thunk. So now let's talk about bringing these two together. Are companies combining these functions? Are we seeing that right now? And if they are, what does it look like? Do you have any best practices that you would recommend?
Alana, I'll defer to you on this one. I'm not seeing it a lot yet, but you may be seeing it a little bit more among some of your customers.
Ooh, so we have a selection bias. We are seeing it more and more because a lot of what we're doing over the last 2 years is kind of refocusing how we explain the value that we provide to our customers with the end in mind. Like blocking bots is important. We all started from being a bot mitigation company. We wanted to expand and showcase our value much better. So we're looking at the actual fraud use case at the end of that. So from that, we're seeing more and more people come to us, whether it's the security team that then brings in the fraud team or the fraud team that comes in all on their own and then discover that the security team is already a buyer on our end, which is absolutely wonderful. But it doesn't happen enough, to your point. But also to your point, it's not just the fraud team. We've already seen several cases. You mentioned media specifically. We had some really amazing successes over the last year with media teams integrating bot management solutions. And the fact that it was them who were leading it allowed us to create different kinds of solutions. Just as an example, blocking isn't always the answer. Sometimes it's something different. Just because you're working with whoever's owning the end solution, like the actual impact on the user, you can have a more comprehensive conversation around options and what it means to the company's bottom line, and not just in terms of whether a bot made it through or not.
That's a really good point, because I'll tell you, while I mostly hear from security people, the second most common end user that I hear from around bot use cases is from the digital or the e-commerce team.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting about that, and goes back to the question of the collaboration, is that usually when I get these calls a lot, it's one team or the other. It's rare for me to have the digital team bring in their security team into the conversation at that point, or vice versa. And sometimes I've even asked the question about, how engaged is your security team in this? And sometimes I get the responses, that's not really their thing. They're focused on other aspects. This is on us. Now, on some occasions, I actually have heard kind of the opposite, where it's more along the lines of, we're leading it, but we are talking to them about it. And that's always awesome.
I think we're seeing something very similar. Like when it's a core, like media or marketing use case, that's where it's coming from. The point where it kind of overlaps with security is if they also have one of the other use cases in mind, like credential stuffing or ATO, and then those two teams collaborate more. But as long as it's pure marketing, then that's the team that we're seeing as well.
But let's talk about ATO for a second, because I do have a data point, I think, Rosemary, that I brought along that you can share, which is in terms of the breaches and in terms of the type of information that is stolen during those breaches. When we asked organizations who experienced a breach what was taken, 40% said PII, 36% said account credentials. Well, guess what those account credentials are going to be used for later? And one interesting thing that I noticed a lot, even as I looked at plans to adopt bot management in the upcoming year, when we looked at organizations that were planning to adopt in the next 12 months that hadn't already done so, and we asked if they had been subject to a breach due to an external attack and how the attacker got in, it was more often through credential reuse. So I can imagine they're choosing to implement bot management now because they realized they were subject to a credential stuffing attack.
You don't need to, you're preaching to the choir when you're talking about credential stuffing, let's put it that way. I think the aha moment for me was about 15 years ago when I got an email from Google saying, you look like you just logged in from China, and I literally just stepped out of the New York subway. Right. That was the point where I changed my wonderful one password that I had like everywhere. I think that's an aha moment that a lot of people are getting, including companies. And the amazing thing is that it's not only powering ATO attacks, because a lot of people then utilize those accounts that were taken over for other attacks. Let's say, just as an example, like over the holiday season, we've seen carding go up like insanely, almost 200% in certain retailers. And one of the ways that you can kind of hide these attacks or keep them under the radar is by taking over different accounts and then using those accounts to run those carding attacks, and then just move to a different account once it's blocked. So it's not just taking over an account for the act of taking over it. It then fuels other attacks.
Absolutely. I wonder sometimes how many of those accounts have, say, saved gift card balances on them that hacker's immediately going to go after.
Yep. And that then again connects with what we talked about on fraud. Like you can have a credential stuffing attack taking over accounts, and then it creates a carding issue, which then turns into someone,
then it's a phone call to the fraud team. And if you don't address it in a way that makes me happy, I'm going elsewhere. Yeah.
Exactly.
I feel like you guys are kind of answering my questions for me. So this is awesome. Thank you so much for like these thorough answers. I guess started talking about this a little bit, but for those that aren't combining these functions, do you think they should? Sounds like yes. And what needs to be considered then?
I think again, binary answers. I have problems with binary answers, but to make a point, yes, people should be combining this. It's the same as with any kind of relationship. You need to talk to create a good relationship. The challenge is that it's not always that simple. With any communication, you need to kind of understand how to talk with each other. So just people need to be aware of that and understand how to bring the other team into the conversation. But to go back to the binary question, definitely. Like again, it's just a question of being successful at what you do. As a security, individual computer contributor or manager, as a fraud person, you would get better results just by collaborating with people around you.
To Alad's point, there is some nuance to this, and the interests of the security and fraud team don't completely overlap, but there is a pretty big Venn diagram there. It's not that it's going to be necessarily the same people, the same team doing both, but maybe you think of it a little bit like DevSecOps, where you have better collaboration between development and security, and they are more comfortable talking to each other. They're taking on some of each other's roles, and they're making each other's jobs easier, but they're not completely doing each other's jobs. And I think that's the nuance, and that's the distinction maybe that Alad was talking about as well. It's not that you're going to have a single security and fraud team and everyone's going to do all of the things, but there is overlap, there are impacts. And in the same way that you need developers and security folks to communicate, you need fraud and security teams to communicate. So I think that's probably how I would draw it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, completely. And it's very similar to if we have like CTOs, for example, listening to this, it's a lot like what happened with DevOps 10, 15 years ago. And it's a lot like what is currently happening with FinOps as well. It's not someone is replacing someone, but there's shared interest and overlap between the teams. And the results will just be better when they work together. You just need to figure out like the relationship between them and how they see this together.
It sounds like it's unifying the protection throughout a customer's journey, from before login to after login in the instance of accounts. So I guess to that point, what use cases would benefit from these teams talking, I guess, other than the ones we've already discussed?
Oh God, most of the bot use cases I think that we've talked about, certainly anything related to credential stuffing and account takeover, shopping cart fraud, inventory hoarding, ad fraud, carding, influence fraud, any of the above would really benefit from better collaboration here. And I think from security's standpoint, there's a real benefit to working with these other stakeholders and teams because it gets them more in the frame of protecting the revenue and driving the revenue versus being seen as, oh, they're this cost center sitting over there. But if they're working with the fraud team to reduce the amount of fraud, which improves your top line and your bottom line, if you're working with the e-commerce team to prevent inventory hoarding, which is going to help with your revenue, if you're doing those things, if you're following the money, if you're working with the teams that impact the money, then as a security team, you are much more tied into the business, you're more relevant, you're more valuable.
I could have said it better myself.
So you won't try to. I love that. Thank you a lot. Thank you a lot, and Sandy. So how does this convergence impact customer trust? There's nothing more important, I feel like, on the internet right now than trust. So how would you say it impacts it?
At a minimum, as a company, if you gain more control and both better mitigate attacks in general, and at the end of it, if you're able to mitigate them fast enough and communicate the context to your customer, that just it builds trust through transparency. I mean, that at a minimum.
Forrester has done a lot of research on trust, and we talk about the 7 levers of trust. Transparency is certainly one of them. Empathy is another one. And I heard you talk a lot about and sort of imply empathy in terms of the fraud team's communication with customers who are often dealing with something really terrible, as someone has stolen from them, taken over their card, something like that. Then from the security standpoint, as you're collaborating, as you're sharing information, you are creating for the customer a greater sense of dependability, that the team is going to be able to address their needs. You're not going to have as many problems. And you're going to have more consistency, which is another lever, because your experience is going to be similar throughout. You're going to have, if you have a problem, the response will be the same regardless of who picks up the phone. But also, ideally, your experience with the organization on the website, through the APIs, whatever, will be similar. And you're not going to have this ongoing challenge of, did something happen to me? So yes, I think all of that collaboration and the information sharing activates several of the trust levers, and that is going to increase consumer confidence, frankly.
Yeah, I like thinking these trust levers. That's a good way of thinking about it. So I wanted to leave some time to go through like some oh my goodness, questions from our viewers. We have one in our messages that I think we should address here. Where would you suggest companies start with this? Big question.
I can start with this. And I'll go back to something I said earlier, which is that many of the end user inquiries I get is from one team or another. Maybe it's from the security team, maybe it's from the digital or the e-commerce team. But in a lot of cases, they don't necessarily know what their counterparts are doing. I would say that is step one. Find out if anyone else in your organization is thinking about bots already, is thinking about these types of attacks, and make sure you are collaborating with them. Have that communication, because what you don't want to do is reinvent the wheel if the wheel is already working well in another department.
That's a good point. I think I'll go back also to something I said at the beginning. It all starts with communication, just learning how these other teams think and behave. So it probably starts with just goals. If you're a security team, figure out what the goals are for the organization and the fraud team as well. Like I think Sandy said it a moment ago, like the bottom line, like what impacts that, and then try to understand how you can help that and how you can connect with those goals through the things that you're doing, whether it's bot mitigation, whether it's WAFs, whether God knows what. It'll up level your conversation with them. It'll create a relationship, and then you'll work together.
To that end, Elad, how much, when organizations come to you and they say we have a bot problem or we have an application attack problem, how much are they aware of, if we're talking about bots, say, the type of situation? Are they aware that it's primarily credential stuffing and what the relative cost of that is versus the cost of carding or inventory hoarding? What's their sense of where the financial pain is?
It depends heavily on what their line of business is at the end of the day.
Yeah.
The more you go down into the kind of companies that deal directly with things like financial services, they have a much more accurate understanding of what's going on, and that's also where we see stronger connections between security and fraud teams. That area is more mature in that sense. With others, the distance is larger, if you know what I mean, a recording distance here, the organizational distance, let's call it that. And at that point, like the conversation usually stays at the level of bots and attacks and the use cases, but not at the precise $ impact.
Makes sense. And I'm guessing then that, yeah, the better they know that, the better they understand that, the easier it's going to be to set those goals that you talked about.
Yes, exactly.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. Is there anything else you want to add in our last minute here?
I'll give a little point of optimism, if I may, Rosemary.
Of course you can. We love an optimistic ending.
Well, which is about bot management adoption and application security adoption overall. We are seeing planned investment for AppSec across the board. be pretty high. Most organizations, a very high percentage, are planning to increase their AppSec budget. And in particular around bot management, I think we have a stat to show that a good percentage of the retail industry are actually planning to increase their investment in anti-bot. So organizations are moving in the right direction here. And I think that is a nice positive note to land on.
We love not ending on doom and gloom. So appreciate that, Sandy. Alad, anything else you'd like to add?
I think that's an excellent stat to end with. It's very positive, especially for us. And then the ownership is on us to prove that we can really solve these problems for our customers.
Exactly. Well, thank you both so much for joining me. Thank you to everyone watching for participating, viewing. We appreciate it. Our comments are always open to questions, and we will get to them another time. Or you can submit a question on our website. We will get back to you. But thank you all so much for the time you took today to talk through the convergence of security and fraud. Have a good one, everyone.